Section 17 of the Book of the Ancient Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. The Book of the Ancient Greeks by Dorothy Mills. Chapter 12, A Day with an Athenian. 1. The Athenian Gentleman. The day began early in Athens. As soon as the sun was up, everyone was stirring. The workman was off to his work, the schoolboy to school, and every booth and stall in the agora was laden with articles to attract the buyers who were expected in the market. Before leaving his house, the Athenian gentleman had his breakfast, a little bread soaked in wine, after which one of his house slaves saw his hymation hung in graceful folds, and then, accompanied by one or more slaves carrying baskets, he set forth for the agora. Here the morning marketing was done, but unless he was giving a very important banquet in the evening, the gentleman did not himself attend to the household marketing. His slaves did that for him and took the purchases home. Their master, in the meantime, would walk up and down the agora, or take a turn or two in one of the porches, where he would meet some of his friends, or go to the barber shop, where he would be sure to hear the latest news of the day. Pericles had proposed to build another temple, and there was much discussion as to whether the state could afford it. The Spartan army was said to be stronger than ever, and Sparta had always been jealous of Athens. Was she secretly getting ready for war? And if so, should not Athens be prepared? Or were those right who believed that the greatness of Greece lay in a policy of peace with Sparta? Perhaps the Olympic Games were being held, and the news had just come and spread like wildfire through the city that the Athenians had covered themselves with glory, especially in the chariot race, and that the victors were even then on their way home, so all must be in readiness to receive them. Or was it known that a galley had just returned from a trading voyage on the Aegean, and that the sailors were reporting that there was a good deal of discontent in some of the islands, and that threats were being made of withholding some of the tribute money, unless the islanders were allowed greater independence? These and many more burning questions of the day were made known and discussed without the use of newspapers. But the Athenian gentleman did not spend all his morning in talk. If he were wealthy, he would have definite duties required of him by the state. He had to fit out and keep in good order one or more triremes for the navy, and there would be interviews with the captain as to the number of men he required and how much they should be paid. There were estimates for repairs to be gone over, and designs for a new and splendid figurehead on the prow of the ship to be approved. Or perhaps it was his turn to provide for one of the choruses in the coming dramatic festival, and he must see to it that this chorus was well trained, and that no expense was spared in making it better than any of the others, so that he might win the prize. Then there were other duties towards the state that were demanded of every free-born citizen. He must sit on the jury and judge lawsuits whenever he was called upon to do so, and as the Athenians were very fond of such suits, the demand came very often. Aristophanes, a dramatist who wrote a number of plays in which he made fun of a great many of the Athenian characteristics, said of the juryman, "He is a law court lover, no man like him. Judging is what he dotes on, and he weeps unless he sits on the front bench of all." In some way or other, every Athenian citizen took part in the actual government of the state, and in the time of Pericles, about 9,000 men held, during the year, some kind of state position. These officials were chosen by the people and were seldom re-elected, so that not only was everybody in turn responsible for certain functions, but everybody was capable of intelligently discussing the affairs of the state, and this was done at great length every day whenever Athenian citizens met together. About once every 10 days the agora was deserted in the morning, and every free-born Athenian citizen over 30 years of age, both rich and poor, was expected to go to the Pnyx, the meeting place of the assembly. In times of war, or when some very important question in which everyone was interested had to be settled, no one stayed away, and there would be great hurrying in the early mornings in order to get a good place. The Pnyx was a great open-air space of assembly, west of the Acropolis and not far from the city wall. In shape it was a sloping semicircle, part of which was supported by a wall. There were no seats, and the citizens had to make themselves comfortable as they could on the bare ground. Facing the slope was a rock cut in the form of a platform and mounted by steps on each side. This was called the bema, and here the orators stood when they addressed the assembly. In front of the bema was the altar upon which was offered the sacrifice that always opened the assembly, and behind it on a rock were seats for the state officials who had charge of the meeting. There were doubtless many days when the business in hand was not very interesting, but there were times when excitement ran high and no one was absent. It is not difficult to imagine the scene. Not far off rose the rock of the Acropolis, symbol of the strength and glory of Athens and of the guardianship of Athena. In the dim distance was the sea, the very bond of union between Athens and the islands of the Aegean and the East, and a symbol of the protecting powers of Poseidon. Overhead stretched the blue Greek sky, and there below in the Pnyx was the densely packed crowd of Athenians, deliberating on matters on which hung their very life or death. It was there that the decision was made to march to Marathon and to face the unnumbered Persian foe. That Themistocles pleaded passionately for a navy, that the messengers from Delphi brought back the answer about the wooden walls, that Aristides persuaded the Athens to free the Ionians from their Persian masters and to form the Delian League, which led Athens to become an empire. And it was there, too, that Pericles, in stately and measured tones, urged the Athenians to beautify their city as no other city in the world had ever been beautified before. These and similar occupations took up the morning of the Athenian gentleman. After a light meal in the middle of the day, he would go to the academy or one of the other gymnasia, where he would spend the cool of the day in exercising himself, or in watching the youths at their games, in walking in the pleasant groves, talking over the events of the day with his friends, or in discussing with some philosophers all kinds of questions concerning new interpretations of old beliefs and new ideas about men, whence he comes and whither he goes. Some of these were questions which are discussed for the first time in the history of the world, and never before, and but seldom since, has there been such an eager desire to know the truth about all things as there was in this Athens of the 5th century B.C. But as the evening drew on and it grew dusk, the Athenians left the gymnasia and returned to the city. All day long they had been in company, and in the evening the most was made of every opportunity to meet again, for they held that to eat your dinner alone was not dining but feeding. So it was very likely that the day would end by a banquet. If that were so, the guests would all have been invited in the morning, either by the host himself when he met them, or by a message carried by a slave. Preparations were usually made for more than the invited number of guests, as it was common custom for guests to bring some additional friends of their own, and uninvited guests would often come by without any special bidding. Since leaving the gymnasia, all the guests would have been at their homes. There they would have bathed and clad themselves in fresh chitons and mantles, and slaves would accompany them to the house of their host. At a banquet the guests reclined on couches, and the food was brought to them on low tables. The evening meal was the chief meal of the day in Athens. It began with fish or meat and vegetables, and when this course was over, the tables were removed, water was poured over the hands of the guests, and garlands were often passed around. Then came the second course of fruits, confectionery, and various kinds of sweetmeats, after which the tables were again removed and replaced by smaller ones on which stood beautifully shaped drinking cups. The guests were given more garlands and wreaths, and the slaves brought in the large craters, in which the wine and water were mixed, and the after-dinner entertainment of the evening began. This entertainment was called the symposium, and it began with the pouring out of 3 libations, to the Olympian gods, to the heroes, and to Zeus. Then the health of the host and of his guests was drunk, after which began the entertainment. This consisted of conversation, singing, listening to music, watching dancers, in playing games, telling stories, or passing around jests. Just what was done at the symposium depended upon the kinds of guests present. When the company are real gentlemen and men of education, said Plato, you will see no flute girls, nor dancing girls, nor harp girls. They will have no nonsense games, but will be content with one another's conversation. More often, however, the guests were less serious. They enjoyed the music of the flute and other instruments. They played games and watched dancing. They chatted and talked pleasant nonsense to each other. When the party came to an end, a libation was offered to Hermes. The slaves were called who attended their master's home, lighting their way with torches or lamps. The older men would go sedately home. The younger would keep up their merriment and go noisily and boisterously through the streets until, having knocked at the doors of their houses, the sleepy porter would wake and let them in, and silence would at length reign in the streets of the city. Part 2. The Athenian Lady. What, in the meantime, was the Athenian lady doing? She was at home, managing all the household affairs and bringing up the children. She educated her sons until they were 7 years old, when they went to school, and her daughters until they were about 15, when they were considered old enough to be married. The Greek writer Xenophon wrote an account of what were considered the duties of an ideal Athenian wife. He imagines the husband of a young bride telling her what he expected of her, and in what way he hoped the household affairs would be managed. You will need to stay indoors, dispatching to their toils without such of your domestics whose work lies out there. Over those whose appointed tasks are indoors, it will be your duty to preside, yours to receive the stuffs brought in, yours to apportion what part for daily use, and to make provisions for the rest, to guard and garner it, so that the outgoings destined for a year may not be expended in a month. It will be your duty, when the wools are brought in, to see that clothing is made for those who have need. Your duty also to see that the dried corn is made fit and serviceable for food. Then, too, if any of the household fall sick, it will be your care to tend to them to the recovery of their health. But there are other cares and occupations which are yours by right. This, for instance, to take some maiden who knows nothing of carding wool, and to make her skillful in the art, doubling her usefulness, or to receive another quite ignorant of housekeeping or of service, and to render her skillful, loyal, serviceable, until she is worth her weight in gold. But the greatest joy of all will be to prove yourself my better, to make me your faithful follower, knowing no dread lest the years advanced you should decline in honor in your household, but rather trusting that though your hair turn gray, yet in proportion as you come to be a better helpmate to myself and to the children, a better guardian of our home, so will your honor increase throughout the household, as mistress, wife, and mother, daily more dearly prized. Some further good advice was then given, and the husband concluded by recommending exercise as the best means of preserving both health and beauty. He said, "I counsel you to oversee the baking woman as she makes the bread, to stand beside the housekeeper as she measures out her stores, to go on tours of inspection to see if all things are in order as they should be. For, as it seems to me, this will be at once walking exercise and supervision. And as an excellent gymnastic, I urge you to knead the dough, roll the paste, to shake the coverlets, and make the beds. And if you train yourself in exercise of this sort, you will enjoy your food, grow vigorous in health, and your complexion will in very truth be lovelier." Added to all these occupations was the education of the children. The Athenian lady had nurses for them, Spartan slave women if they were to be had, for their discipline was sterner than that of other Greeks, and the Spartan nurses had the reputation of being able to keep their young charges in particularly good order. All kinds of toys were provided for the children: hoops, balls, spinning tops, and go-karts, dolls, and toy animals. The Athenian mother learnt to be a good story-teller, for it was in these early days that the children wanted stories told them, and in many a tale would she relate of the gods and the heroes of old, of the nymphs and spirits of the forests and mountains, of the sea and of the air. And when night came and the children must go to bed, then she would sing them to sleep with a slumber song. "Sleep, children mine, a luxurious sleep. Brother with brother, sleep, my boys, my life. Blessed in your slumber, in your waking blessed." The girls had to be trained to all the duties of an Athenian wife, and there is much to learn in the short years of their girlhood. It was a domestic training that they were given. Of other things they learned as much or as little as their mother knew herself, and was able to teach them, probably not more than a little reading and writing. A girl was not encouraged to take up any kind of intellectual pursuits, and during her life, before her marriage, she was generally most carefully trained to see and hear as little as possible, and to ask the fewest questions. But it was not all work for the maiden, and many a time did she sit in the swing in the courtyard, and idle away a warm afternoon, gently swinging to and fro, and many a merry game of ball did she have with her companions. It was she who made the fresh garlands and wreaths for the altars over the house, and who, when the moon was full, laid offerings on the tomb of her grandparents. And most glorious of all her girlhood privileges, it was she who helped to weave the robe taken to the temple of Athena at the time of the great Pan-Athenic festival, and who bore baskets of offerings to the goddess in the great procession. When the Athenian maiden married, all this life came to an end, and she took upon her young shoulders the training of her own household, even as she had seen her mother do. Her marriage had usually been arranged for her, and she often knew but little of her future husband. Before the marriage day, she offered all her girlfriend treasures to Artemis, the goddess who had watched over her childhood. Her tambourines and pretty ball, and the net that confined her hair, and her dolls and doll dresses, Timaretta dedicates before her marriage to Artemis a maiden to honor as it fit. Do thou, daughter of Leto, laying thine hand over the girl Timaretta, preserve her purely in her purity. When these symbols of her youth had passed from her keeping into that of the goddess, the maiden was dressed in beautiful raiment, crowned with a wreath, and covered with the bridal veil for the marriage ceremony. This took place in the evening on a day when the moon was full, and when she was ready, the bride was led by her attendant maidens to the court, where the bridegroom and her parents and the invited guests awaited her. The marriage took place in the court. A sacrifice was offered and a libation poured out to the gods, and then the marriage feast followed, at which cakes of sesame were always eaten. This was the only occasion on which women were allowed to be present at a feast. But through it all the bride remained closely veiled. When the feast was over, the bridal chariot was driven up to the door, and the bride took her seat in it beside her husband. Her mother walked behind it, bearing the marriage torch, with which the fire on the hearth of her new home would be lighted. The guests surrounded it, and with flute playing and singing escorted the bride to her new home. If the bridegroom lived in a distant place, the bridal procession broke up at the gates of the city. But if he lived in Athens, he and his bride were escorted to the door of his house, where they were met by his mother, and then, to the music of a marriage song, the bride was led into her new home. Did the Athenian lady have no amusements or recreation? Did she leave all that was gray behind her when she became a wife? The Athenian lady seldom left the house, and never unless attended by a female slave. She had practically no society but that of her slaves. The peasant woman in the fields and the few women who sold in the market had the society of their friends, but such companionship was denied to the well-born lady. She saw no men except those of her own family. If the husband dined at home, she shared his meal, but if he had guests, she was unseen. From time to time she took part in the great religious festivals and processions, and occasionally she was permitted to be present in the theater when a tragedy was performed. But she was never permitted to see a comedy, for the wit and humor were often coarse, and were considered unfitting for her ears. In many ways it was a strange life that the Athenian lady lived, one that seems as if it were in contradiction to all that the Athenians held of the highest importance. For the Athenian lady lived in the house among a people that lived out of doors, among a people who gave great importance to physical training. She was advised to take her exercise in bed-making. At a time when the human spirit was at its freest, she was enclosed on all sides. Art and thought and letters were reaching the highest development that they were ever to know, but for her they hardly existed. But whatever was the actual life of the Athenian lady, the Athenian ideal of womanhood was very high. In the wondrous temple that stood above the city, looking down upon it and guarding it, was the figure that symbolized to the Athenians all that was good and beautiful and true, and it was the figure of a woman. It was always the figure of a woman that represented victory, and nearly all the great Greek dramas deal with the fate of a woman, who was generally the wife or daughter of a king. The sacred mysteries of Eleusis, mysteries of such deep meaning that it was said that partakers in them had better hopes concerning death and all eternity, centered around the story of the love and sorrow of a woman. A race that could produce such great figures as these must have thought nobly of womanhood. And so, in spite of her subordinate position in the background, The Athenian woman was a real influence in Athens. She reigned supreme in the household, and as her sons grew up, they recognized in her those qualities which every Greek, and especially the Athenian, was taught to value so highly. That quiet courage which by its very steadfastness overcomes the little anxieties and annoyances of daily life, and that self-control and self-mastery which, putting self in the background, sets free the individual for service to others. The Athenian ideal of service was that the man should give it wholly to the state, and the woman wholly to her home. But narrow as was her horizon, limited as were her opportunities, the Athenian woman exercised an influence in Athens that helped to strengthen and preserve some of the noblest Athenian qualities. End of section 17.